I remember the moment I stopped being who I was. It wasn't when the doctor told me there was no heartbeat. It wasn't when they took my baby away without letting me hold her. It was a few hours later, in a dim, silent hospital room, when a nurse I didn't recognize walked in and handed me a pamphlet about grief, laid it neatly beside a plastic cup of water, and said, "You'll feel like yourself again, eventually." But I never did, and I suspect she knew I wouldn't. It was 20 years ago, but that moment has lived in my bones every day since, not like a wound, but like a quiet echo. My daughter, Grace, was stillborn on a rainy Thursday in late March. I was 31, married, hopeful, and already imagining what her voice might sound like when she learned to say, "Mama." None of that happened. Instead, I left the hospital with empty arms and a name written on a birth certificate that would never belong to a living person. I buried Grace in a small cemetery near the edge of town, beside a cherry tree that bloomed a week late that year. The flowers were white, too white. I remember thinking they looked wrong against the dark, wet earth. People grieve differently. Some talk, some collapse, some rage. I did none of those. I simply folded inward. I stopped attending baby showers. I smiled politely when people said, "Everything happens for a reason." I found reasons not to visit friends with children. My husband, Paul, tried to hold space for me in those early months, but I think he wanted his wife back more than he wanted to understand the woman I had become. We lasted 3 more years, quietly unraveling like a rope too worn to hold any more weight. After the divorce, I moved across the state, rented a small cottage near the coast, and took a job as a school secretary. I didn't tell anyone about Grace. It wasn't that I was hiding her. It's just that no one asked, and I didn't volunteer the story. It became a silent part of me, like a scar under clothing, always there but rarely seen. For years, my life was simple. I rose early, walked to work, came home to quiet evenings. I made peace with my routines. I found a rhythm that didn't hurt. I even laughed again, now and then. The honest kind, the kind that surprised me. I never remarried. I never tried to have another child. People often assume that means I didn't want one, but that's not true. I just never felt like Grace had left room for someone else. She was the child I had, even if only for a moment, and in some strange, ineffable way, she filled the whole space. Time passed, slowly, kindly. I aged. Then, last winter, I got a call from my cousin Beth. We hadn't spoken in years, not from animosity, just life pulling us in different directions. She told me Aunt Clara had passed, my mother's older sister, the last of that generation. I hadn't seen Clara in over a decade, not since she had a stroke and was moved into assisted care. I remembered her as sharp, a little controlling, always the keeper of family secrets, and the kind of woman who labelled everything with masking tape and dates. "She left you something," Beth said over the phone, "in a box. Said it was private." I didn't know what to expect. Clara had never been warm to me, but she had always taken a certain interest in my life, especially after Grace. She was the only one in the family who came to the burial. She stood a little apart, holding a black umbrella and staring at the cherry tree like she was waiting for it to bloom then and there. We never spoke about it afterward. A week later, the box arrived. It was smaller than I expected, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper. My name written in Clara's shaky handwriting across the top. No letter. No explanation. I sat with it unopened for nearly 2 days. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. When I finally opened it, I found several old photographs, most of them familiar. Family gatherings, blurry Polaroids from the 80s, a few postcards Clara had saved from her travels. Beneath those was a small envelope, no address, just the words, "For Lillian, when she's ready." My hands shook, not because I was afraid, but because my body seemed to recognize something my mind hadn't caught up with. The paper was yellowed slightly, the handwriting tighter than Clara's. I opened it carefully, unfolding a single sheet of notepaper. The message was short. "There are things you weren't told about Grace." I couldn't keep the truth anymore. She was breathing. I heard her. But they took her from you anyway. I read it once, then again, then a third time. At first I thought I was misunderstanding, that it was a metaphor, a figure of speech, some grief-addled thought Clara had written down in confusion. But the words were too plain, too deliberate. She was breathing. They took her. My breath caught in my throat, sharp and strange, and my fingers gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the letter clutched in one hand, the box in the other, and stared into a past I had buried under 20 years of silence. My mind began to pull threads I hadn't touched in decades. The way the doctor hadn't met my eyes, the hush that fell over the delivery room, the fact that I had never seen Grace's body, had been told she was too fragile to hold, that burial arrangements had been handled already, that I didn't need to see her. I had believed them, because grief dulls your clarity, because you want to trust the people in white coats, because when you're told your baby is gone, you don't ask for proof. You collapse. But now, I wasn't sure what had really happened in that hospital room 20 years ago, and I was no longer willing to leave it alone. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I found myself unable to tell what parts of my life were real and what parts had been given to me in pieces, curated, filtered, rearranged by others. The letter from Clara had torn a seam open inside me, and I couldn't stitch it closed with memory alone. My thoughts no longer moved in a straight line. They looped back and twisted in on themselves, catching on details I had long since dismissed. The way the nurse avoided eye contact that night, how quickly they moved me from the delivery room to another floor, the long silence that followed the doctor's quiet phrase. She didn't make it. There had been no further explanation. I hadn't asked for one. I had been too broken to speak. But now, the questions screamed. At the time, I'd been grateful not to deal with the arrangements. Now that same convenience felt suspiciously like concealment. I called the hospital, not even certain they would still have records after 20 years. The woman on the line sounded tired but polite. She asked for my name, the date of delivery, and the baby's name. Then there was a pause. Too long. Too still. "I'll have to call you back," she said finally. "Some of these files are archived. It may take a few days." When I hung up, I sat in silence and stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again with some kind of explanation. It didn't. That night, I reread the letter again, not because I thought it would change, but because part of me still didn't believe it was real. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. Clara hadn't been confused. She had meant exactly what she wrote. She was breathing. I heard her. But they took her from you anyway. What did that mean? Who was they? And why? I thought about my mother. Long gone now, buried in the same cemetery where Grace was supposed to be. She and Clara had been close once, but their relationship had cooled in later years, something to do with an argument I was never privy to. Suddenly, I wondered if that argument had anything to do with me, or with Grace. I tried calling Beth, my cousin. She was Clara's daughter, and though we hadn't been close since we were teenagers, she had always been kinder than the rest. When she answered, her voice was wary. "Did you get the box?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And the note." A long pause followed. "I didn't read it," she said. "I didn't want to." "Did Clara ever mention Grace to you? Ever?" Beth sighed. "Only once, years ago. She asked if I believed everything doctors say. I thought she was just being dramatic." "Why?" "She said Grace was breathing," I said quietly. "That she wasn't stillborn. That they took her." Beth didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was softer. "I always thought there was something strange about how your mother handled it," she said. "She never talked about Grace, not even once. It was like she erased the whole thing." My stomach turned. "Do you think Clara would lie about this?" I asked. "No," Beth said. "Not about that." After the call, I sat with that truth, heavy and shapeless, and tried to decide what to do next. I needed something tangible, something outside of memory. So the next day, I drove to the cemetery. The grave was still there, under the same cherry tree. The stone was small, flat, and unassuming. It bore only her name, Grace Elise, and the date, 1 day long. I stood over it for a long while, watching the petals drift down from above like falling snow. I knelt and ran my hand over the stone. Something about it didn't feel right. Not anymore. I couldn't explain it. It was like touching the surface of a locked door. I went to the cemetery office and asked to review the interment records. The clerk was an older man with reading glasses that kept slipping down his nose. He flipped through a dusty binder, frowning. "Strange," he said. "There's a plot listed here under her name, but no burial record. No casket details. Just a notation that the site was reserved and marked." "Is there a record of the funeral home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and gave me the name. I drove there the same afternoon, a quiet building with a neat lawn and an empty parking lot. The woman at the front desk found the file, dust-covered and thin. She frowned as she opened it. "This is odd," she said. "We billed the hospital directly, not the family. There's no transportation record, no casket receipt. It's more like a placeholder than an actual service." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "It means," she said slowly, "that there's no proof we ever received a body." I stood in the lobby, holding the file, and felt the ground shift beneath me. Grace might not be in that grave. And if she wasn't there, where was she? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the glow of the porch light flicker against the window pane, the letter still open on the table beside me. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. Not with grief, not with fear, but with one steady, aching thought. If she lived, then who took her? And why would they let me believe she died? I wasn't sure yet what I would find, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Not until I found out who had stolen my child. Not until I knew the truth. Not until Grace came home. I spent the next several days walking through a version of my life that no longer felt entirely mine. Everything I thought I had laid to rest, the grief, the stillness, the acceptance I'd worked so long to construct, had been quietly rearranged by a single note, a few words scribbled by a woman who, for reasons I could only begin to guess, had decided to speak up. And now, each corner of my past felt newly suspect, every memory touched by the suspicion that I had trusted the wrong people, or worse, that I had accepted too easily what I had been told, because believing otherwise would have demanded something unbearable. It had never occurred to me to question the hospital. I had no reason to doubt the doctor's word when he said there was no heartbeat. In that moment, I wasn't a woman looking for evidence. I was a mother losing her child. But now, I found myself revisiting that night with a forensic kind of focus, remembering the faces that had passed through the delivery room, the tone of the nurse's voice when she told me to close my eyes and rest, the fact that no one ever asked if I wanted to see the baby. They had called her Grace in the paperwork, but I never spoke her name out loud to anyone that night. And yet the name appeared, spelled correctly, filed on official forms as if someone else had chosen it for me. I returned to the funeral home again, this time asking to see anything they hadn't shown me the first time. Handwritten notes, call records, payment instructions. The woman at the desk was kind but hesitant, telling me again that the file was remarkably thin for a case involving an infant death, especially one where the mother had not been involved directly in the arrangements. I asked if it was possible the hospital had sent paperwork without a body. She paused, then said it had happened before, but only under rare and specific circumstances. Medical donation, legal intervention, or situations with external involvement. That phrase hung in the air. I drove back home with the windows rolled down, hoping the cold air might bring clarity, but instead it only heightened the ache growing behind my ribs. I was starting to wonder whether I had ever been given the truth at all. And more than that, I was beginning to suspect that my loss had never been natural. That evening, I pulled out the box again, Clara's box, and combed through it piece by piece. I checked the backs of photos, reread the cards and scraps she had tucked inside, searching for anything that might point to what she had meant in that note. And then I saw it, tucked beneath a postcard from 1972, a folded piece of paper, brittle and faded at the edges. It was a receipt, handwritten. From the hospital, dated 2 days after Grace's birth. It listed 3 items: delivery suite charges, postnatal stay, and transfer to special facility. I stared at the last line. No facility name, no code, no explanation. Just that vague phrase, in a different handwriting than the other 2 lines, darker ink, a sharper slant. I called the hospital the next day and asked for the administrative department. I gave the receipt number. The woman on the line hesitated, then transferred me twice before someone picked up and confirmed that, yes, that line referred to a neonatal transfer. Not uncommon, she said, for newborns who required urgent care in specialized units, especially if they were non-responsive at birth. But Grace was stillborn, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Another pause. I can't confirm that without a full chart, she said. Can I access it? I asked. You'll need a formal request, possibly a court order if the file is sealed. That word, sealed, hit me harder than I expected. Why would anything in Grace's record be sealed? I hung up the phone, hands cold, and sat staring at the wall for several minutes. If Grace had been transferred, if there had been breath, any flicker of life, and they hadn't told me, then what happened to her after that moment was something more than tragedy. It was a decision. And if it was a decision, someone had made it. That night, I didn't dream. I lay awake, the ceiling faintly outlined in shadows, the house holding its breath around me. I thought of Clara again, what she had seen, what she had chosen to say only when her own life was nearly over. And I wondered if her silence had been guilt, or fear, or something else entirely. I thought of the doctor. I couldn't even remember his name, and the way he avoided my eyes. I thought of my mother, of the look she gave me when I tried to talk about the burial, a look that now seemed less like sorrow and more like containment. In the morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I told him I needed help accessing a sealed hospital file from 2 decades ago. He asked a few questions, gave me a measured look, and said it would take time. I said I had waited 20 years already. I could wait longer, but I wouldn't stop. And then I asked him something I hadn't said out loud until that moment. If there's no body in that grave, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts, and if Grace lived, even for a moment, is it possible she wasn't declared dead at all? He looked at me for a long time before answering. It's rare, he said quietly. But yes, if she was transferred and revived, even briefly, and especially if there were complications with paperwork or intentions that weren't above board, it's possible. What would that mean? I asked. It could mean she wasn't buried. It could mean she was placed into state custody. And in the worst kind of cases, it could mean someone arranged something they shouldn't have. I left his office and sat in my car for nearly half an hour before I could turn the key in the ignition. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since opening Clara's note. But something deeper than tears filled me that morning. A cold, steady fire that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage that had taken 20 years to find its voice. Because if Grace had lived, and someone had taken her from me, whether through greed or cruelty, or some institutional failure too ugly to name, then I hadn't lost her. She had been stolen, and I was going to find out who had taken her, and why they had lied to me for half my life. The process of uncovering the past was nothing like the movies had led me to believe. There were no dramatic revelations tucked inside secret folders, no dusty file boxes containing the full truth, no confrontation where someone finally broke down and confessed. What there was instead was bureaucracy, cold, indifferent, and achingly slow. I filed formal requests through the hospital's archival system. My lawyer sent inquiries, citing my rights as the mother of a potentially misidentified child. We were told the process would take time. There were privacy laws, sealed documents, a chain of approvals that moved with the speed of molasses and the warmth of stone. In the meantime, I focused on what I could control. I tracked down the name of the doctor who had delivered Grace, a man named Richard Mallory, now long retired, living 2 towns over in a small house with blue shutters and a weathered driveway. It took me a week to work up the courage to knock on his door. When I finally did, it was late afternoon, and the sun had begun to sink behind the trees, casting a dim golden hue across the neighborhood. He opened the door slowly, leaning on a cane, and peered at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Doctor Mallory?" I asked. "Yes. My name is Lillian Mercer. I think you delivered my daughter in 2003, at Rose Hill General. Her name was Grace." His eyes didn't change, not visibly, but he opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The living room was modest and neat, filled with quiet reminders of a life once lived with purpose. Books stacked carefully on low tables, a photograph of a younger man in a white coat beside a plaque for 40 years of service. He gestured for me to sit, then lowered himself into a chair across from me with visible effort. "I remember you," he said after a long pause. "You were young, scared. It was raining that night." My throat tightened. "I was told she was stillborn," I said. "But someone in my family left me a letter saying that's not true, that she was alive, that she was breathing." He nodded slowly, as if the words didn't surprise him. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "There were instructions?" "What kind of instructions?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "The baby wasn't dead," he said. "She was weak, unresponsive at first, but then There was a gasp, a flutter of breath, enough to act, enough to report. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. Why didn't you tell me? There was an order from the head of obstetrics, something about neonatal research, facility placement, risk factors. I was just I was a cog in a wheel much bigger than myself. They told me to log the birth as still. They told me you had signed consent. I didn't sign anything, I whispered. They had a form with your name, your signature. I stared at him, the world around me narrowing to a sharp, stinging point. If someone had forged my name, if someone had used my confusion, my grief, my trust, then this wasn't just a lie. It was a theft. Where did she go? I asked. Where did they take her? I don't know, he said. All I know is that she was transferred to another facility within 24 hours. That was the last I heard. They sealed the file. No further notes. I stood up, too suddenly, and had to steady myself on the edge of the table. Why didn't you speak up? I asked. His voice was old, tired. Because by the time I realized how wrong it was too late. And then I didn't know how. I left his house without saying goodbye. The air outside felt colder than before, and the sunset looked harsher, as if the sky itself was ashamed. I drove for hours that evening, aimlessly at first, until I ended up parked in front of the hospital. It hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same brick walls, the same flickering light over the emergency entrance. I sat there, staring at the building where my life had broken open, and whispered to myself, "You're not buried. You're somewhere. And I will find you." The next week brought a reply from the records department. A letter arrived, confirming that the hospital's internal audit had uncovered inconsistencies in the file. My name appeared on consent forms I never signed. Notes from a now-defunct neonatal program were attached to Grace's birth chart, flagged with a code that no longer matched any existing unit. The hospital offered apologies, platitudes, the possibility of compensation. I didn't care. What I wanted was a name, a destination, a path to the child I had been told was dead. With the help of my lawyer, we traced the transfer code. It led to a state-run medical facility that had closed in 2005. Records from that time were spotty, many lost in a fire, others never digitized. But there were rumors of programs involving infants, adoptions under unusual circumstances, research that had never been fully disclosed. I began to contact former staff members. I sent emails, made calls. Most were unreachable. Some refused to speak. But then, one evening, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was small, cautious. A woman in her 60s who said she had worked as a pediatric nurse during those years. "I remember a baby girl," she said, "born under strange circumstances, transferred without full documentation. We were told to call her Anna." I nearly dropped the phone. "Do you remember anything else?" She had dark hair, big eyes. She stayed with us for about a year. Then someone came for her. Not an adoption agency. Something else. A private placement. I asked questions. I was told not to. "Where did she go?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," she said. "But I always wondered what happened to her." I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. Someone had taken my child, changed her name, moved her through a system designed not to protect, but to disappear. And now, finally, after all these years, I had something I hadn't dared hope for. A name. Anna. She was out there, and I was going to find her. Once I had a name, not a confirmation, not a guarantee, but a single possible thread. My world began to revolve around the act of pursuit. Every hour that passed without progress felt like a fresh betrayal, as if I were failing grace all over again. I no longer operated within the rhythm of ordinary life. My mornings began with search queries and ended with lists of agencies, directories, scattered scraps of handwritten notes. I found myself looking into the eyes of young women in coffee shops, on sidewalks, in grocery aisles, wondering if any of them had been born in March of 2003, if any of them carried a name they hadn't been given by birth, if one of them might unknowingly belong to me. My lawyer, Mark, helped me file a formal request to the Department of Health and Human Services for records pertaining to Anna, born on the same date Grace had been. We did not claim legal standing in the request. We couldn't, not yet. But we framed it as a historical inquiry tied to a medical rights review. It was a stretch, and we both knew it, but he believed that if enough pressure was applied in the right language, something might surface. We sent copies of Clara's letter, the handwritten hospital receipt, and the confirmation of the altered consent forms. We demanded an audit of the neonatal transfer program. Meanwhile, I dove into online databases, combing through public adoption records, family forums, and social media posts. I searched using the name Anna, paired with every variation of birth date and region I could think of. I joined message boards, where adoptees posted their birth stories and biological mothers searched for the daughters they'd lost to closed adoptions. Most of the time, the messages read like prayers thrown into a void. Hopeful, raw, unanswered. One night, bleary-eyed from hours of reading, I found a post that stopped me cold. It was dated 5 years earlier. A young woman named Anna had written, "I was born in March of 2003. I was told I was a safe haven baby. No record of a birth mother. No medical file. I've always felt like there's something missing. If you're out there, I just want to know who you are." I stared at those words for a long time. There was no picture, no surname, just a username, part of an old forum that had long since stopped being active. I copied the post, read it again, then sent a private message through the site, though I had no idea if the account was still active. That message became part of my daily ritual. I checked it every morning and every night, even though I knew the odds were low. Still, it was something real. A few days later, Mark called with news. "We got a partial file," he said. "No birth mother listed. Transferred from a medical facility under emergency custody order." "Does it list where she went?" I asked. He hesitated. "Only the first placement, a foster family in Pine Harbor. She was there for just under a year, then moved again." I wrote the name down. Pine Harbor was a coastal town, 2 hours away from where I lived. I knew the area. Quiet, old-fashioned, with a population that rarely changed. It was the kind of place where people remembered faces. The next morning, I drove there. The town was exactly as I remembered it. Narrow streets, wooden houses with salt-worn shutters, a post office where the same 3 cars seemed to be parked out front all day. I visited the local library first, spoke with a woman named June behind the desk who had worked there for decades. I told her I was researching a child who had been in foster care in 2003, and she tilted her head slightly before saying, "We only had 1 placement that year, far as I remember. Sweet girl. Didn't stay long." I asked if she remembered the foster family's name. She tapped her chin, then said, "Miller, I think." Out on Cypress Lane. They were older, not looking to adopt. Just kept the baby for a while until someone else came through. I found the house easily. It was white, peeling slightly at the eaves, with a wind chime that tinkled just enough to be heard over the breeze. An older woman answered the door, cautious but not unkind. I introduced myself gently, explained that I was looking for information about a baby girl they had once fostered. Her eyes shifted. "Anna," she said, voice low. She was just a baby, came with nothing, no medical chart, no birth record. We were told she'd been surrendered, but we always thought it seemed strange. She had a scar behind her ear, looked like a surgical incision. No one could tell us why. We weren't allowed to take her to an outside doctor. I asked what had happened after that. "She was taken by a private adoption agency," the woman said. "A man and a woman showed up with paperwork, said the transfer had been approved. We weren't even told their names. She was gone the next day." I asked if she remembered what they looked like. She closed her eyes. The man was tall, dark suit, very formal. The woman had red hair, very pale. They didn't speak much. They just took her. When I left, I felt like I had stepped deeper into something that no longer resembled a story of medical error or bureaucratic failure. This had the shape of intention. And now, there were faces. Vague, distant, but faces nonetheless. That evening I checked my messages again, and there it was. A reply. From Anna. Short, hesitant, careful. "Hi. I saw your message. I don't know if this is anything real, but I've had this feeling for a long time. That something about my story doesn't add up. I'm willing to talk. Just tell me who you are." I sat there staring at the screen, my breath caught halfway between inhale and collapse, and for a moment, the world quieted around me. Not with finality, but with possibility. I placed my hands on the keyboard, knowing that whatever I wrote next would change everything. I responded slowly, choosing each word with the kind of deliberate care I hadn't exercised in years, as though the smallest misstep could send her running from a truth she hadn't asked for, but that belonged to her all the same. I didn't tell her everything at once. I didn't want to overwhelm her with the weight of 20 years compressed into a single message. I began with the essentials. My name, the date of her birth, the hospital, the inconsistencies in the records, the letter from Clara. I told her I wasn't sure of anything yet, but that I had reason to believe she might be my daughter, and that I had waited a long time, too long, to reach this point. I kept it honest. I kept it human. I pressed send and sat back, staring at the screen, heart thudding so loudly I felt it in my hands. She didn't reply for 2 days. I tried not to let my thoughts spiral, but every possible scenario ran through my mind. Maybe she didn't believe me. Maybe she'd dismissed it as some sad woman's delusion. Or maybe, and this possibility haunted me most, maybe she read my message, believed it, and simply didn't want to know. On the third morning, I woke to find her reply sitting quietly in my inbox. "I don't know what I feel right now. Part of me wants to delete this and pretend it never happened. But I've wondered for years if someone was missing. My parents, the ones who raised me, always dodged the details. I've asked questions they never answer. I've always felt like I came from somewhere else, like I was assembled from pieces no one could name. I'm scared. But I'm curious too. I'm willing to talk. Not by message. Do you want to meet?" My hands trembled as I read those words. Not with panic, but with something far more delicate. The kind of fragile hope that comes after a lifetime of silence. I replied yes, told her I would drive anywhere, meet her anywhere, that I didn't expect anything from her except the chance to sit across from her once. She gave me a cafe name, Neutral Ground, in a town not far from where the adoption agency had once been based. It was the sort of choice someone made when they didn't know what they wanted yet. when they weren't sure whether to reach forward or retreat. I understood that space well. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. Too early. The cafe was small, all warm wood and soft yellow lighting, the kind of place where time moved gently. I sat by the window, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea that I kept refilling just to give my hands something to do. The minutes ticked by. I watched the door every time it opened. I tried not to guess who she would look like. I reminded myself that this wasn't a reunion, not yet. This was a beginning, one she might walk away from. And then she stepped inside. She was taller than I had imagined, her posture guarded but steady. Her hair was dark, pulled back simply, and her eyes, those eyes, were the exact shade I had seen in my own reflection for more than half my life. I knew then, even before she sat down, even before she spoke. There was no blood test in the world that could have told me more than that one quiet glance as our eyes met across a room neither of us had ever entered before. She walked toward me with hesitation, and I stood without realizing I had moved. We didn't hug. We didn't reach. We simply sat, hands folded in front of us, two strangers tethered by a question that had taken 20 years to form. She introduced herself as Anna, as if we needed formality to contain the moment. I told her my name again, even though she already knew it. We spoke carefully at first, small details exchanged like offerings. I asked if she'd been happy. She said yes, in ways. That her parents had been kind but distant. That her childhood had been ordinary but filled with silence. That questions were discouraged. That no one ever mentioned a hospital or another name. I told her what I knew. The birth, the night I was told she had died, the note from Clara, the doctor who admitted the truth too late. I watched her face shift with each piece, not breaking, but stretching under the weight of something larger than either of us. She didn't cry. Neither did I. The moment was too new for grief. What we felt was something quieter. Recognition without context. The eerie familiarity of knowing without understanding. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph. It was a school picture, a year or two old, and she placed it in front of me without saying a word. I picked it up slowly and stared. Her smile was hesitant, the corners of her mouth uncertain, but her eyes were unmistakable. I had seen those eyes in the mirror every day until I'd trained myself to stop looking. I used to imagine my mother was out there, she said softly, but I never thought she'd be looking too. I never stopped, I answered. We sat there for nearly 2 hours, talking in circles, overlapping timelines, trying to make sense of 20 years lived apart. There were gaps we couldn't fill, years that belonged to no one and both of us at once. But something had settled by the time we stood to leave. Not a resolution, not yet. But the beginning of something that could become whole, at the door. She hesitated. I don't know what this means yet, she said. I don't know what I'm ready for. I understand, I told her. Take your time. I'll be here. And I meant it. Whatever came next, whether she called again or disappeared, I had done what I came to do. I had found her. I had looked her in the eye and given her the truth. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence no longer belonged to someone else. It belonged to both of us. And it was finally starting to speak. In the days that followed our meeting, I moved through life with a sense of delicate suspension, as if I had finally stepped off a cliff I'd been clinging to for decades, and instead of falling, I found myself floating slowly toward something new, uncertain, but no longer alone. Anna hadn't promised anything that afternoon. She hadn't spoken of next steps or feelings or intentions, and yet the way she had looked at me, Not with anger, not even with disbelief, but with an open, searching quiet. Told me that a door had been left ajar. I didn't want to force it open. I didn't want to rush towards something she wasn't ready to build. I only wanted her to know I would still be there, waiting if she ever decided to walk through. I didn't write to her the next day, or the day after that. Instead, I returned to my ordinary life, which no longer felt so hollow. I answered work emails, went to the store, washed the dishes, folded laundry with my hands moving automatically, my mind still half in that small cafe, watching her reach for her cup. The subtle way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a gesture I recognized with a pang that was neither pain nor joy, but something deeper, something that belonged to both. At night, I took out the folder I'd kept hidden for months, the one with copies of hospital records, Clara's letter, legal filings, and timelines scribbled in my own handwriting. I laid everything out on the table and, for the first time, didn't feel anger when I looked at it. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion. Not defeat, but the kind that arrives at the end of a long journey, when your body knows it cannot go any farther, and your heart finally gives you permission to rest. A week later, Anna sent a message. She said she had thought about everything, had read and reread the things I'd told her, had gone back to the few scraps of paperwork her adoptive parents had allowed her to see. She had asked them direct questions. They had responded with deflections, vague references to difficult circumstances and best interests. And when she pressed them for clarity, they became quiet, more uncomfortable than defensive. The kind of silence that signaled not ignorance, but complicity. She had always known, she wrote, that something was wrong with her story, but she had never known what question to ask. Now, she had a shape to put around the feeling that had followed her all her life. She asked if she could see me again, not to talk about the past, but simply to be in the same room and see if the feeling she had at the cafe would return. That strange familiarity, the quiet sense of being known without having to explain herself. I said yes, of course, whenever she was ready. She suggested a walk, something simple, no expectations. We agreed on the park near her apartment, a place I had never been, but which, when I arrived, felt somehow already familiar. We walked slowly along the path that wound past the pond, under trees just beginning to shed their summer leaves, neither of us speaking much at first. She pointed out a tree she used to climb, a bench where she liked to sit and read as a teenager, as if showing me parts of her life she had once believed she owned alone. I told her about the garden I kept behind my cottage, the stubborn tomatoes that refused to grow this year, the way I'd taken up baking just to fill the house with scent and warmth. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real. Two women walking side by side, tethered by blood and broken years, not trying to repair what had been lost, but simply sharing the space where something new might begin. She asked me if I had kept anything from when I was pregnant, and I told her I had. A blanket I never used, a small stuffed bear I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and the name Grace, written carefully in a journal I hadn't opened since the night she was born. She didn't flinch. She asked if she could see those things someday, and I told her she could, whenever she wanted. As we parted that afternoon, she hugged me. It wasn't long or tight or tearful. It was a quiet, honest gesture, her arms folding around me in a way that didn't need explanation. I held her carefully, mindful not to grip too tightly, not to ask for more than she could give. That night, I lay in bed and allowed myself to imagine what it would mean to have her in my life. Not as a fantasy or a hope, but as a presence. I thought about holidays, about long conversations over coffee, about the possibility of knowing her in the way I had once only dreamed. But I also knew not to rush it. She had spent her entire life building a sense of self in the absence of this story, and now the ground beneath her had shifted in a way that might take years to fully understand. A few days later, she sent me a photo. It was of the two of us at the park, taken by a stranger she had quietly asked to snap the moment. We were both looking out toward the water, our backs slightly turned to the camera. But even from that angle, I saw the closeness, the unspoken ease that had begun to grow between us. She wrote, "I'm still figuring out what this means, but I'm glad I met you." And I sat there with that photo in my hand for a long time, not crying, not aching, just breathing in the truth that after all these years, after all the silence and searching, the story was no longer about loss. It was becoming about return. Time, once an adversary I had measured by anniversaries and empty rooms, became something altogether different in the months that followed. It no longer marked absence or distance. It became a space where something quietly mended, not in dramatic, sweeping gestures, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that piece by piece began to form a life neither of us had expected to share. Anna and I didn't try to force a relationship into the shape of mother and daughter, not right away. What we built instead was rooted in something quieter, a mutual willingness to learn each other's language, even if some words still caught in our throats. She came over on weekends, sometimes just for tea, sometimes to sit in silence while I folded laundry or repotted a stubborn plant that refused to thrive in the winter light. Once, she brought an old photo album from her childhood, not to show me what I had missed, but because she wanted me to see what her life had been, not as a wound or an accusation, but as a history she had finally allowed me to witness. We would sit at the kitchen table, flipping pages slowly, and she would point to pictures of birthdays, school plays, vacations at lakes I had never heard of. Her voice would soften when she spoke about the woman who had raised her, a woman she described not unkindly, but without warmth, as if kindness had been offered out of obligation rather than affection. I listened without judgment, without interruption. I knew better than anyone that love, when denied its rightful shape, twists into forms that are hard to name. One day, she asked if I had ever wanted to start over, to try for another child, to build a family again. I told her no, not because I hadn't longed for love, but because the space she had left behind had felt too sacred to fill with anything but remembrance. I had loved her too completely, even in her absence, to imagine placing another child in the shadow of that grief. She nodded and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Sometimes I wonder if I would have been the same person with you." And I answered honestly, "You would have been different, but not less, just shaped by different hands." I didn't tell her about the nights I spent imagining the life we might have had, the first steps, the scraped knees, the drawings taped to the fridge, the soft questions whispered before sleep. Those images belonged to a version of me that had lived entirely in silence for 20 years. And now that she was here, the weight of those imagined years had begun to lift, slowly, like fog from a field. As the seasons turned, Anna began to include me in parts of her life I hadn't dared hope to see. Not as a mother in the traditional sense, but as someone she trusted to witness her becoming. She invited me to her apartment for dinner, let me meet the friend she called her closest, asked my opinion on a job she was considering. None of it was dramatic. None of it was ode. But each moment landed with the quiet weight of something earned, not by right, but by persistence and presence. And yet, even in that soft unfolding, there were days when the pain would return, not as grief, but as a kind of echo, a reminder that the years we had lost could never be reclaimed. She once showed me a scar just beneath her hairline, the one the foster mother had mentioned. She didn't know where it came from, no record of a surgery, no explanation in her file. Just a mark, unexplained, a question carved into her without consent. "I used to touch it as a kid," she said, brushing her fingers lightly over it. "I thought maybe it was from something important, something people didn't want me to know." I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to say how much I hated the system that had handled her like a transaction, how I wished I could rewrite every line of her history. But instead, I said the only thing I truly believed. "It didn't take anything away from you. It couldn't." She looked at me, eyes shining, and I knew she believed me. That winter, she stayed with me for 3 nights during a snowstorm that knocked out power in her building. We cooked by candlelight, wrapped ourselves in blankets, and sat by the fireplace while the wind howled against the windows. It was the first time she slept in the room that had once been meant for her. The nursery I had never finished. I hadn't changed much about it. The walls were still bare, the furniture minimal. But I added a lamp, a warm quilt, and a photo of her as a child on the nightstand. She didn't say anything when she saw it, just placed her bag down and turned the light off gently before bed. On the second night, as we drank warm cider in the living room, she said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel safe with someone who's technically a stranger." And I answered, just as softly, "You were never a stranger to me." She reached for my hand and held it, not like a daughter reaching for her mother, but like one human reaching for another who had waited too long to be found. That moment stayed with me, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it marked a quiet, permanent shift. We were no longer two people circling the shadow of what had been taken. We were two people beginning to shape what could still be made whole. And though the past would never be returned to us, the future, tentative, unfinished, open, had finally begun to offer itself, one gentle step at a time. Spring arrived with the kind of quiet promise that no longer felt symbolic, but real. The days grew longer, the trees thickened with green, and I watched the lilac bushes outside my kitchen window bloom with a kind of reverence I hadn't known since I was young. Anna began coming over more frequently, never with ceremony or announcement, but with the ease of someone who had begun to understand that her place here was not conditional. She would let herself in with the spare key I'd placed under the chipped ceramic frog on the porch, the same spot I'd always said was for someone who needed to feel welcome. I had never imagined that person would be her, and yet now it felt as though it had been waiting just for her all along. We settled into a rhythm. Sunday afternoons became ours, sometimes spent walking in the park, sometimes curled in opposite ends of the couch with books we'd trade when finished. She was still careful, still slow with certain questions, but the silence between us had softened. It was no longer the absence of understanding, but the kind of silence that follows deep repair, when words are no longer needed to reassure because presence itself has become the language. One afternoon in May, we drove together to the cemetery where I had once believed Grace had been buried. I hadn't returned in years. The headstone, small and weathered, still bore her name, the only proof I'd had for 2 decades that she had ever existed. Standing there beside Anna, whose name was never carved into that stone but who had lived on despite it, I felt the final veil lift from everything I had once believed. She stood beside me for a long time, not asking why I had brought her, not filling the space with unnecessary words. When she finally spoke, it was quiet, but sure. "I used to have dreams about being buried alive," she said. "I never knew where they came from, but I'd wake up gasping, like I was trying to claw my way out of something. I felt the blood drain from my face. Maybe this is what it was," she said. Not the literal place, but the lie. The idea that I was gone to the one person who was supposed to keep me. I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it, her fingers curling around mine, not out of obligation, but with the kind of grip that acknowledged something hard-earned and fragile. Together, we stood in front of that stone, not to mourn what had been lost, but to witness, fully, finally, what had been stolen and returned. That night, she stayed for dinner, and we talked about things that weren't tied to the past. She told me about a trip she wanted to take to the coast, asked if I'd ever been to Ireland, admitted she was thinking about changing her name. Not completely, not to abandon the identity she had grown up with, but to add something. "I want to include Grace," she said, lifting her gaze to mine. "Not because I feel like I need to be someone else, but because she and I are the same. She's who I was, and I want to give her a voice now." The tears came then, not in a wave, but as a quiet stream I didn't try to stop. She didn't look away. I told her about the dreams I used to have too, the ones where I was holding a baby I couldn't see, only to realize I had no arms, nothing to cradle her with, nothing to keep her from being taken again and again. "I never dreamed of being found," I said, "only of losing." "Well," she said gently, "we're both here now." And in that moment, it felt like everything that had unraveled so violently 2 decades ago had in some small way begun to reweave itself, not into what once was, but into something else entirely. Not a replacement, not a fix, but a new thread. In the summer, she moved into a small cottage 2 blocks from mine. Not because we needed to live in each other's pockets, but because she wanted to be near. We shared dinners, errands, lazy Sunday mornings reading the paper side by side. She met a few of my friends, came with me to a book club where no one asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. When she introduced me to others, sometimes she called me Lillian, sometimes she paused, unsure of what word to use. I never pressed her. I didn't need to hear "Mom" to understand what we meant to each other. Once, we were sitting on the porch during a thunderstorm, watching the sky crack open with light, and she turned to me and said, "Do you think we would have been close if none of this had happened?" I thought about it. "I think we would have loved each other differently," I said. "But I think the bond would have been the same. What we have now, it didn't come from biology or time. It came from choosing each other when we didn't have to." She nodded, tucked her legs up beneath her, and leaned her head against my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, and we sat there until the storm passed. By the end of that summer, I had made peace with something I once thought would haunt me forever. Not just the loss of Grace, but the silence that followed. I no longer needed to scream into the void to be heard. I had been found. She had found me, and I had found her. Not by chance, not by accident, but by the quiet persistence of truth pressing its way to the surface, one whispered note at a time. We never had a confrontation with the hospital. There was no grand lawsuit, no dramatic court battle. By the time we received the final documents confirming what had happened, the illegal transfer, the sealed adoption, the administrative cover-up, we didn't feel the need to punish anyone. The damage had already been done, and the system that had once erased her now stood powerless in the face of what we had rebuilt. We didn't need justice in the form of retribution. We already had the only kind that mattered. We had each other. And after 20 years of silence, that was everything.